One of the amazing things that we have to show guests at and beyond Sossusvlei Desert Lodge is the geology of the region. You can see the lodge just down below us. As soon as we get up on the hill right behind it, we're already into some of the really interesting geology of the area. When you come to Sossusvlei Desert Lodge, you may have been on safari around Southern Africa, and quite often what you end up doing is spending most of your time sitting on game drive vehicles. And so this is a fantastic place to get out and explore a bit on foot and in various other ways. And one of the cool things that we have to do here is this geology experience. So we do a walk, it's around about 4 kilometers, it'll take a couple hours, and the guides will explain the basics of the geology of the area. And you end up getting up on this beautiful hill and seeing the view of the desert out below. When we look at the geology of the area, we've got 3 main sequences that are exposed here. We have the really old Sinclair Sequence, it's this reddish rock that the lodge is built on top of. Above us, on top of the hill, we have this black sequence called the Nama Sequence, really interesting band of rocks. And then deposited in the valleys and exposed here and there is the younger sequence called Sonderp Sequence. The reddish band of rock that we have around the lodge is called the Sinclair Sequence. It's not very well understood, but essentially it's a big mush of a bunch of different time periods, and so it's a metamorphic complex. We have rocks in there that are granites, we have rocks that are basalts, sedimentary rocks, all sort of mushed together. The next sequence up above the Sinclair Sequence, which we're now on top of, is the black limestone that forms this thick band behind us, the Nama Sequence. We know that that Nama Sequence was created by an ocean, and we find a few bands sort of sandwiched between these 2 periods of rocks that we sort of have to interpret for ourselves. One of the most interesting bits is this conglomerate, where we find quite nice round rocks that are embedded inside this rock, and we presume this is from early rivers flooding in with the formation of an ocean that eventually became quite a large ocean. This rock here is the black limestone of the Nama Sequence. It's a really interesting band of rock. This is rock that would have been at the bottom of an ocean. It's really strange to think of limestone as being something black, but it's because of all the heavy minerals, iron and magnesium and so on, that was in the environment flooding in to form this ocean. Now the origin of this ocean comes from the time that the continent of Gondwana was forming. We had these land masses smashing together, squishing out all the oceans that were between them, and that water that was displaced had to run out, and so it ran out on top of the continent itself. So this was a large ocean sitting right on top of a continent. Another band of rock that we find, again at the base of the Nama Sequence, is this band of quartzite. Quartzite is a very, very hard metamorphosed sandstone, so it's essentially highly squished sandstone. It forms a really hard rock. It's the type of rock that in other places in the world was quite frequently used as for stone tools. Not so much here, but again this probably dates back to the forming of the ocean that was eventually to become the Nama Sea, and as sand was pushed in, forming the base of the ocean before eventually limestones deposited on top of it. Up on the hill now we've got this beautiful view out, and we can see quite a bit of the geology that has taken place since the older stuff that we're sitting on top of. The black hill that you can see on the right hand side there was formed with a continental split, and so we had this massive amount of fissuring, and it would have been a pretty bad time. Massive volcanoes formed elsewhere in Namibia at that time as the continents were breaking up, and the subsequent action within the land that just kept cracking it. So the black stuff is actually volcanic rock that spewed out. And then we see the youngest geological feature, the Namib Sand Sea, which has become Namibia's 2nd World Heritage Site. This bit of red stuff that you see there is part of a dune field that spans 34,000 square kilometers. Within the quartzite that I showed you earlier, we get these bands of chert, again another rock that's often used as stone tools, although not so much in Namibia. The chert that we get here is just really beautiful. Up in this area just above the lodge we tend to find yellow ones, red ones and white ones. Presumably that just shows the amount of iron deposited in each little bit of it. So one of the interesting things that we find in the Nama sequence are these bands of stromatolites. Now if you were to look at this, most of it's actually made up of quartz, but These lines would have been made up of bands of stromatolites that were single-cell organisms in these oceans. These oceans would have been here very long ago, 500 plus million years ago. And at that time, the only fossils that we find at all in this material are these single-cell organisms. When we look at bands of rock like this, we're not geologists or mineralogists, but it's kind of fun to think back in your own head how these kinds of formations might have been caused. So we see here a piece of quartzite lined quite clearly with a piece of chert on top of it. And so what may have happened here, you had the quartzite forming early, and a band of limestone may have washed down from a hilly area outside of the ocean. In that, or perhaps later on, some amount of iron would have been washed in from certain volcanic areas, all that percolating through to eventually create this very distinctive red rock.